journalists ought to think about seriously. And the other is the so-called Richard Desmond problem, that if he creates a voluntary system and the day after that Richard Desmond or someone else stands up and says, well, actually, that's great, I don't want to be part of it, it's not going to look very credible. And so he's saying, well, help me. How am I supposed to set up a system that is voluntary but has no real effect? And I think, collectively as an industry, we have to help him with that, rather than just saying we're not going to have anything that looks like statute.
I think you quite approved of, or at least some of the measures suggested by Paul Dacre in his evidence, and indeed by Lord Hunt. Is there not a possibility that if those measures go through, and indeed the industry for once, unlikely that this is, the newspaper industry got itself together, in other words, a united front, they could head off Leveson's inquiry, or at least his report at the pass, and do many of the things that he would perhaps want to recommend. I know he's a bit worried about this, in that he doesn't want to be second-guessed by this, but would that be not a good
Well, I think that's an important question. So is this a situation which could be solved as in the past by the press getting together, cobbling together a deal and saying it's okay, you don't need the last chance saloon because we've invented this thing here. So I think some people want to go with something that's all tied up in pink ribbon and say, there you are, Lord Leveson, we've sold it for you. I don't think he wants that. I think he certainly definitely wants constructive proposals, but I think he thinks, hold on a minute, that's partly my job. And the second thing is whether actually the industry is capable of agreement in advance. So, there are good things, as you say, Paul Dacre's suggestion for some kind of ombudsman. I think there's no great quarrel with that. I think the polluter pays principle that he talked about, I think most people would get behind that. The contract system, probably, but there's a lot of detail there which people are still unclear about. So it would be difficult for the industry to go to Leveson and say, yes, we agree to that, if you haven't even agreed to what the contracts would be. But I think the bigger problem at the moment is that what's being proposed still looks like self-regulation. It's still got a body like PressBOF, which is the Press Board of Finance, which is the industry body that sits on top of the Press Complaints Commission as the ultimate controlling thing. And my sense is that Leveson is looking at something that is more like independent regulation than something that looks like self-regulation.
I would have thought perhaps Lord Hunt is looking at that too, to a certain extent, but I might be wrong.
Well, yeah.
I think that
the Hunt model currently has this thing called PressBOF at the heart of it, and my guess is Leveson's going to look at that and not be very impressed. Yeah, no,
I was thinking more of putting editors. The great complaint always about the PCC, or one of the great complaints, has been that it had a number of editors on the Adjudication Council, and I think that just out the question now, and I think they understand that. Yeah. Do you feel the media, politicians, and the legal profession are fascinated by this? And the conference has been discussing it now for a couple of days, among other things, of course. But do you think the public really cares about journalists breaking the law? Bearing in mind, of course, I'm not diminishing it, but phone hacking, terrible, shouldn't have done it, but exactly, it's a parking offence compared to some of the things that have been going on, and indeed, things that are now people are being charged with. Do you think the public really care, unless there's high-profile people arrested and go to jail?
I think for the public, it fits into a wider concern and pattern about the integrity and legitimacy of institutions in this country. So you saw it with Parliament, MPs' expenses. You've seen it with banking and the finance industry, and it's now hitting, you saw it previously with trade unions, and you're now seeing it with the media. And all these are great axes of power. And I think my sense is that the public were shocked by what had gone on, what has been revealed. They've come to a sort of settled view of it, that it was extremely unattractive and needs reform. Whether they are following every day of Leveson and watching it on Sky Plus when they go home, I rather doubt, because I think they've reached their decision and want to see reform. And I think, certainly our own traffic, it very much depends on the story of the day, but there's a great interest of people coming to the Guardian site who remain very interested in this.
The power, of course, that you're talking about here is the power to damage, isn't it? It's not the power really to influence. I mean, it might influence society. But when Lord Beaverbrook, in that first Royal Commission in the Press after the war, said, when asked why a newspaper, said for propaganda, my lords, and no other reason, he was after power. Everybody, with the exception possibly of Richard Desmond, is looking for power in some area. But that's not the power that you're talking about in plurality, with plurality, for example. I think I mentioned to you, because you weren't here, that Max Mosley earlier suggested that power could be dissipated by plurality, by having plurality of ownership, and that you'd have a lot of different people owning papers. It didn't seem to me to do very much for that. What do you feel about that in terms of, and would you agree, where's the power? There's power to damage, there's power to do harm, but what power is there to actually influence governments and...
Oh, I think huge power. I mean, I think that is coming very clearly out of Leveson, and it was very clear last July. There was an extraordinary moment when the Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, they stood up and said, we admit it, for far too long we were not in the pockets of these people. Of course, they wouldn't put it like that, but we were far too beholden to them. And they believed that Murdoch had the power to make and break political parties and influence elections, as well as, and you know, this is where his power came from. They had it was believed that he had this ability, and politicians also believed that he could break them personally, and you know, that wasn't so wrong either. Now you see the sort of the trade in criminals who are employed precisely to dig up the dirt on people. So that was a huge power, and you know, we could argue forever about whether voters actually made their decisions on election day based on what the Sun told them to. Probably not, but they were immensely influential holders of the debate, and twice during the Leveson inquiry, people have gone along and said, in a world-weary way, well, that's always the case. That was true of Beaverbrook. That was true of Northcliffe, as if that was a good thing. You know, so Northcliffe did it. Beaverbrook used to wield his power to try and destroy politicians. So therefore, it's always happened. So I see it differently. I mean, I think what Leveson has revealed is a series of oligarchs and billionaires and very powerful companies who are in a position to buy these papers, and there is much good in that. But they also have immense influence, and I think, you know, going back to where the public is on this, in any other walk of life, we would question that degree of influence and wonder where the accountability is. And so if you have a situation where the accountability failed, that is a matter which is, I think, of concern.
Yeah, I understand. I think that, yes, going back, I agree with you. It wasn't necessarily a good thing that when Beaverbrook exercised his power, for example. Mind you, he did try and restore the empire, which wasn't very successful, was it, with influence on politicians. And obviously, if there are, where there is journalism that is trying to expose politicians, things like that, of course we disapprove. But don't you think actually this is a problem for politicians? Politicians are not supposed to be influenced by people. They're not supposed to. Of course they have relations, and did when I was in newspapers, certainly with the press, but not so close that they could be tarnished in the way they are now. And indeed, what's happening at Leveson may see a cabinet minister go this week.
Well, we would agree they shouldn't be, but I think in reality we know that they were. And
But won't we in reality know that somebody who buys a newspaper would try to exercise power, because that's part of the deal. That's part of owning a newspaper.
Yes,
newspapers
but this is why plurality matters, because I think the shocking thing in retrospect is that this man, stroke company, difficult to make the distinction sometimes, which owned 40% of the national press, was effectively about to double in the dominance that it had in life generally, you know, which goes across politics, goes across sports rights, goes across movie rights, goes across the platform on which everything is held. And the particular thing about Murdoch, and you know, to this degree, it is about News Corporation, though there are obviously broader principles, is that in each of the markets in which he operates, Australia, America, and Britain, he has the posh papers, which give him the influence and open the doors. He has and lose the money. He has the broadcasters, which make the money, and he needs the regulatory framework in order to make the money for the broadcasters. And he has the tabloid papers, and in Britain he was employing networks of criminals to dig up the dirt. And those three things worked together to get him to leverage the power he needed to make the money. And there is probably no email or piece of paper on which which you can pin that down exactly and say, oh, there's the deal. But I think everybody in this room understands that that was the situation. And that was, I think, a baleful period in British public life, and we can all agree it shouldn't have been like that, but it was like that. And that's why the plurality issue, I think, is the biggest one that Leveson has to say something about.
But and we mentioned this, I mentioned it to you earlier, though, it's not said very much about Richard Desmond, is it? It's not said very much about the Mail Group, which is very powerful, but because it has only 2 national newspapers, I guess, rather than 4, that has all those regionals out there, it doesn't have a television station. It's probably more powerful than any of those you're talking about. Richard Desmond, who has 4 newspapers and 1 television station, as you said, not a big share of the market, but nobody talks about because it doesn't appear to exercise power at all except power to make money.
No, but if Associated tried to buy ITV, there would be an outcry, wouldn't there? They would say that is far too much power. But Sky TV is much bigger than ITV. And the whole thing was Sky found itself through a combination of Tory and Labour governments in a completely different regulatory place and sort of slipped through. And I agree that the failure to challenge Desmond buying Channel 5 has given Sky another little chink that it can get through, because it's used the argument. It says, nobody protested about Desmond, so why are you protesting about us? There is also the whole question of bundling, that all the way through the Sky deal, I'd sat on platforms like this, and you'd sit there with Sky spokesmen who tried 2 different arguments. One was Sky is a completely different company, there's no problem, which is a sort of tremendously disingenuous argument if you think James Murdoch was across both of them, but they wanted you to believe that. Or, actually, we control Sky anyway, so there's no change of control anyway, so what's the problem? And then they said, there's going to be no bundling of all these interests. They're completely different, and we're going to keep them different. But in the famous Jeremy Hunt letter to David Cameron in November 2010, he says to Cameron, look, I've just spoken to Murdoch. He's got this tremendously exciting vision, which he's going to bundle together iPads and iPhones and newspapers and TVs and put them all on the same platform. Shouldn't we be encouraging that? So there are all these slippery arguments that were floating around at the time, and because pluralities and competition law are complex things, most people didn't concentrate on them, except the coalition. You've never seen a period in which all newspapers got together and said, my God, if this happens, this is going to seriously be damaging to the rest of the press.
Absolutely.